Hey class, in this video I'm going to be going over adding platforms and the background to our Godot scene that we have so far. I'm going to start by downloading the project template. So if you're on Blackboard, you can click on the Open Lab link, or you can just go directly to the Open Lab and go to the lectures page and then scroll down to the bottom under the genre area. There's a link to download the Lab 2 archive, just like we did for Lab 1. We're going to redo a couple things here. I've restructured the project a bit. There is a way to take assets from your old project and put it into a new project. I haven't figured out exactly the right way to do that so far, but in future lessons, we'll try to start doing that so we don't have to recreate everything. But we're still kind of at the beginning, so we're just going to recreate a couple things. Anyway, I'm going to click on the Download Lab 2 archive. And on the Mac, you can see that that automatically opens up my downloads folder and also unzips the archive. If you're on Windows, you're probably going to have to right click and click extract all, and you're going to want to create a new folder to put the assets in. So the first thing that I want to do is put my lab into my class folder. So I have my MMP 270 folder on my desktop, and you can see I have the Lab 1 there. So I'm just going to drag Lab 2 over here. And then if you want to continue working with your character sprites, you might want to grab the sprites from your previous project and then drag them into the sprites folder in the new lab. I actually created some new art this week for my character. I was kind of sick of looking at the first character that I made, so I wanted to make something that was a little more basic. So I created a new character. So I'm going to go through putting that in and do a tiny bit of review there. You can notice that there's a few things different about the way this project is set up. I have like a new scripts folder because I have 2 scripts in here. Eventually we'll kind of add to the complexity of the project. We'll probably have like a scenes folder and an audio folder as well once we get through those lessons. I also have some of my art already downloaded. I'm going to take a look at those real quick in Piskel and then put those in my sprites folder. So I'm going to delete this zip. And so for the art that I created for this week, I'm going to open up my sprites folder over here. So I created a new version of the character that's just a little bit simpler. I have the walk, the jump, and the idle. So I'm going to redo my character animations, and some of those should still be, some of the basics will still be there in the project, but I'll have to input my new sprites. I also have a couple new scenery items. You guys should have at least 3. I just have 2 because I'm just doing a demo. One is these clouds, and you can see the cloud is a sprite sheet, but it's actually not going to be animated, and we'll see why as we go through the demo. I also have some platforms, and you can see I have a few different types of platforms. I'm also going to go through why we have those in the demo. Let's look at my Piskel setup real quick before we start looking at Godot. So I have my character, and here's the cloud. So I'm going to add these clouds in different places, but you can see I did clouds on 4 different frames in my sprite, and that's just a little bit of an easier way to organize it. Instead of having like a whole bunch of different files with 1 cloud each, I can actually just export the sprite sheet, and then I can use each one of the sprites individually. They don't have to be animated. Another thing I want to point out here is look at how much space I have around the cloud. With these scenic elements, I'm not as concerned with having too much space around the art because I'm not as worried about collisions and having the right alignment. But I do want to make sure, especially when I'm using a sprite sheet in the way that I will be with this one, that I don't have too art close to the edges, because that'll create some kind of glitchy clipping and fragments that I don't want in the scene. So those are my clouds. That's one of my scenic elements. I also have a big sprite of background clouds. So I'm going to show 2 different ways to kind of put backgrounds into the scene. And so this is just like a big scene that I made. I made this one the same size as my game scene. So the game scene is 1024 pixels by 512 pixels. So I actually made this art canvas the exact same size, and then I did some drawings the way that I would want it to look in the scene to have a background. And so we'll look at both ways of adding scenery into the game. Finally, I have the platforms over here. You can see I have a grid view turned on here, and that's going to be really useful for the way that the platforms are set up in Godot, because you can actually see what it's going to look like when you import it into the editor. So the way that I had that set up is under settings. If you go to the grid setting, you can turn the grid on and off. If your canvas is very small, you probably won't actually see that. It's only if you have a pretty big canvas that you'll see the grid, because the spacing is by 32 pixels. So the size of my canvas here is 256 by 256. I didn't use the whole thing, but you can add more tiles here or make the canvas bigger, obviously. So I can set the grid size by clicking on these different buttons here, but I can also change the grid spacing. So I can have a very small grid or larger. You probably want to go with either 16, 32, or 64. That'll match up nicely in Godot. Obviously, if you go with a smaller grid, you're going to have smaller sprites or tiles as when we go into Godot. So you may not have to spend as much time drawing, but you will have to spend more time kind of organizing stuff. If you have 32 pixels, that's kind of in the middle. That's what I went with. And then 64 pixels, you have larger areas that you have to fill up, so they might be more detailed, but then you probably spend less time inputting them in Godot. So 32 is kind of a good middle ground. But you notice, like, if I go down, it still kind of works. Like, I could still use this as a 16 by 16 grid. Since it's smaller than the 32. If I go up to 64, I'm going to have some issues with this, so I probably won't go up. Anyway, 32 is good here. And to point out a couple more things, I kind of drew outside of the lines in some cases. That's fine as long as, for example, like in this element right here, if I had like art right here, then it would show up in this sprite. So I don't want that. So I want to make sure there's at least like one box in between where I have art here and where I have some art here. And so these are really simple. I didn't spend a whole lot of time drawing these. I just wanted to have a couple examples, but we're going to look at a few different types of sprites. So, or tiles rather. We have a single tile for each of these guys. Then we have like a multiple tile set here. And then this, we're going to do an auto tile. We're going to do a really simple version of an auto tile, which will be able to make different sizes of the platform. And the reason that one looks, I just used shapes here, is just to make sure that these lined up correctly. I could have spent a little bit more time, drawing it by hand and just lining things up, but just for the sake of the demonstration, I wanted to do that quickly. So I think that's all of the art, and I exported those at just their regular size. So scale is 1, because I really want to make sure that the grid matches when I go over to Godot. Obviously, if I made the scale twice as big, then the grid would still match if I upped it to 64. But to make things easier, I want to make sure that my grid, which is 32 pixels here, matches the grid that I'm using in Godot. Okay, so that's my art. So let's import that into the scene and then get started actually editing it. So I have my clouds here. I have my platforms, and then I just noticed that I actually did not download my background clouds. So let's go ahead and download that. And then with this one, I'm also going to export it at scale as 1, because I designed it to be the same size as my Godot scene. So I'm going to download that. All right, so now let's go into Godot. So I'm going to close the downloads folder and make this guy a little bit bigger. So we have lab 2, and we have most of the same files. I can actually double click the project.godot to open up Godot if it's set up correctly. If you're on Windows, that might not work. You might have to like choose Godot as your main program. But another way that we can do that, other than double clicking, is we can open up Godot first. So on Mac, I'll just go to the Spotlight and type in Godot. You can do this on Windows if you have Godot in your search bar or on your desktop or something like that. And so then I'm going to go to import, and I'm going to browse, and I'm going to find my lab 2 folder. So for me, that's on my desktop in MMP 270. Then I'm going to open up the lab 2 folder and select project.godot. So I can open it either way. And I'm going to click import and edit. So that's going to add a Godot project there. And so now we're going to see there's not anything really in the scene right now. I'm going to click on this to zoom in. We have our player set up here, and none of our art is in there. But we have our main scene, our player scene down here, and then we have some sprites, and then you should have these scripts as well. So I'm going to start just by recreating the player really quickly. The animation player is still there. But I made new art. If you want to import your old art, that's probably what you would want to do. One thing I forgot to mention in the last video is that when we're importing sprites, we actually want to turn, if we go to import up here and look for this filter setting, we want to turn that off. Since we're using pixel art, we don't want Godot to like change the scale or the way that the pixels blend together. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn filter off for all of those. It's something that you might not really notice, but I forgot to mention that that's when we're using pixel art. And if you're not using pixel art, you can ignore this. But when we're using pixel art, we probably want to do that. So I have my sprites folder. I'm going to open up my player scene and just center this guy and go back to the scene node. So I still have my animation player with my 3 animations, and I actually still have the sprites here as well, but the art is missing. So your art is going to be missing. You can re-import it, and if it's all set up, it should work fine. You may need to redo some things. It actually looks like the idle animation is gone, but okay, the jump and the walk animation are still there. For some reason, the idle animation is missing. But let's just recreate these. So in my sprite, I'm going to go to the texture node here. And, there's no texture there where it says empty. And I have my sprite. Whoops, I zoomed in a little too much. So I'm going to click in load and then go to sprites. And since this is idle, I'm going to choose my new character idle and click open. And my idle animation is not there, so we don't see that yet. So let's turn this on. And it's a slightly different setup. So I'm going to click the horizontal frames. Nope, not that one. Vertical frames. There we go. Okay, so that looks better. And I want to make sure my collision shape is in the right place. So I'm actually going to drag that here so I can see it and make it a little bit bigger and just move it up a little bit. Okay, that's pretty good right there. Just want to match up the art. So let's go to our jump. And I want to make sure these guys all line up. So again, I'm going to go to texture, I'm going to go to load, sprites, and find my jump sprite. And that looks like it lined up pretty good. So I think that one's fine. Then let's go to walk, go to texture, load, sprites, and I'll find the walk, open. That one we can see there's some clipping. So I have fewer frames in this walk cycle than I had in the previous one. So I'm going to take the horizontal frames down 1. And you can just move those around until you get what you want. And so then let's go to our animations and just make sure those are correct. So the jump animation, drag this up a little bit. Okay, the jump animation is mostly intact. I guess we have 1 less frame, so I'm going to move this back and just change the duration to 0.5. And it looks like the cycle button is off, so I'm going to make sure that that's on. And let's see. Okay, so that jump animation is pretty good. I could play around with that, but I'm not going to spend too much time here. So then let's check out our walk animation. So now we only have 2 frames in the walk animation. I used to have 4, so I'm going to go here about halfway and just change the length. And the cycle for that one is on, so that's good. And I just made this kind of like simple walk animation. I didn't want to spend a ton of time on that, but everything else is set up correctly. So then if we go to the idle animation, that's where we have some work to do. I guess that somehow got deleted. So I'm just going to set it up the way I want. So I'm going to turn on the idle animation, leave jump and walk invisible, and then I'm going to keyframe the visibility for each one of those. So I'm going to go to add track, property track, so idle, okay, and search visibility or visible, click open. and then add the keyframes. So we're gonna go here and insert key. And we need to do this to make sure to turn off the different sprites. So let's go to the jump. This one we don't want to be visible. And so it's not visible here, so that's right. I'm gonna keyframe this, right click and then keyframe. And then we're gonna add one more track, the walk track, the visibility. So this is a little bit of review, just kind of setting this up again. And then I'm gonna insert a keyframe there. Okay, so now we have to actually add our walk frames. So I can use the add track, or I can just go up to the frame and click add keyframe. And it's gonna say, do I wanna add a new track? And I'm gonna say create. And so then we have this frame. And so let's jump ahead. Okay, so let's go to here and go to 1 and keyframe. And then for my idle, I actually want to wait a little while before I wave. So I'm going to move that to here and then insert another keyframe here and here and here. And I think that should be it. Yeah, so that's pretty good. If I want to make that even longer, maybe I'll make this 1 second, and I can select all these keyframes and drag them over a bit. So there's a little bit of a longer pause. So I've set up my character animations. You might need to reset a couple things there. And it's good to review this as well. So now that we've got our player set up, we can go back to our main scene and start adding our tiles and our platforms. So let's go back to the main scene. And so right now we have this player in the scene. That looks pretty good. If I preview the scene, we can see the player, but he just like falls through the bottom of the scene. Obviously that's not what we want for our game. So we need something for the player to land on. And the easiest thing to use in that case are platforms. And we can use a tile set to make adding the platforms a lot easier. So one of the things you'll notice in the main scene that's new is this platforms. And this is actually a tile set that I renamed platforms. So the way that I added that is I went to main scene, add child node, and then I searched, this is actually a tile map. So I made a tile map, but then I renamed it platforms, because you can add as many tile maps as you want, and you can even add, versions of the same tile map on top of each other. So in the platforms, we don't have anything in here, but you'll notice as soon as I turn platforms on, we can see a grid. And you can see the size of the grid is set to 32 by 32. I think the default is actually 64, but since I was working with 32 by 32 art, I changed that to 32. So you can change the size of the cell here as well. But now that we have this grid, and that's going to make it easy for us to draw our tiles. And it's going to work really nicely with the art that we made on Piskel because we were using the same size grid. So we have this tile map, but we need tiles to actually draw on it. So under the TileSet property, that's blank, I'm going to click New TileSet. And then I'm just going to click on the TileSet, and that's going to open this tile editor down here. One thing you can do if you want a little more space to work is you can click on this button, and it'll make that section take up the whole space. And then when I go back to main scene, it'll be back there. So then to get back to the TileSet editor, I go back here. So I'm going to start just by doing a single tile. And the way I set up my TileSet editor is I get my platforms, which are in my sprites folder, and I drag them into this kind of left pane. This is where all the art goes. You can see they're pretty small. So if I want to zoom in, I can zoom in like that. And so then I can add tiles into the art. So I'm going to start with the single tile. So I'm going to click New Single Tile. And I'm going to click this like snapping magnet on. That's going to make it a lot easier to select the art that I want to select. And then for a single tile, I'm basically just going to select one tile on the map. So I'm going to start with this tile here. And that's just kind of a scenery tile that goes under the tiles that our player is going to stand on. So I'm actually not going to add anything else here. So that tile is done. I'm going to click New Single Tile again. And I'm going to click on this guy. And this is where my player is actually going to like land on there. So I need to add one extra thing to this tile, which is a collision. So I'm going to click on the collision. I'm going to choose the square box and just click right here. And since I have snap to grid on, it just fits in perfectly. It's really easy. If I had this off, it would allow me to kind of like shape this, but I actually don't want to do that. So I'm going to leave it as is and then turn my tile back on. So I'm going to save this. We're going to come back here in a minute, but we're going to add some tiles. So we have a couple tiles. Let's go back to the main scene. And now when we choose a platforms, it's going to open this Tilemap editor over here. And we have these two different tiles that we created. So first I'm going to start with the actual platform that our player lands on. And the Tilemap editor is really easy. We just, select a box and we just draw straight across, and it just adds the tiles in there. And if we want to get rid of a couple tiles, we use the right click to remove. And so then I'm going to choose the other tile that does not have a collider to kind of fill in the bottom of this scene. Obviously I didn't spend a ton of time on the art here. It doesn't look super good. There's really easy ways to make like repeating patterns and stuff like that make it look a little bit more realistic. But you guys can work on that on your own projects. Anyway, so now that I have my tile set up, when I play my scene, now my player actually lands on my platform. So now I can actually play the game. You can see my player is pretty slow and can't jump very high because it has the default settings. And if I fall off the edge of the tile, I have the same problem. But at least we have something to land on. That's a good start. So when we first play our scene, we land here. You'll notice the camera is also now moving with the player. I'm going to go over that in a little bit. So that's adding a single tile. That's pretty cool, but it could be pretty tedious to design our whole scene using single tiles. So let's go back to our TileSet editor, and we'll choose this TileSet again. And so now let's add a single tile that actually takes up a little more space. So I'm going to do a new single tile again, and I'm going to choose this entire region here. Okay, so I'm adding 6 tiles as one tile essentially. The player is going to be able to stand on this platform as well. So I'm going to go to collision, and I'm actually just going to draw a shape at the bottom here. So I'm going to move this down, move this down. And so the player will be able to kind of like stand inside of this tile. And that's it actually, all I have to do for this tile. So I'm going to go back to the main scene, and let's go over a bit and click on our tile map. And now I'm going to choose a new platform. So one thing you'll notice with this platform is that it only selects one tile when it gets added. So I can actually add like multiple versions of this guy next to each other. There's no real reason to do that. They're just kind of overwriting each other. So what I want to do is just skip over here. That's just to point out that it's not going to like force you to, put them in increments of 3 or whatever it is. But then I can put like another guy over here, and now we're starting to actually create a little platform game. So let's see if we can make it. I don't think this player can jump enough to get, oh, maybe he can. Oh, I made it to the first one, but I can't quite get to the second one. So one thing that's nice about Godot is I can click on my player, and let's add to the jump force. Let's make that like 400. And let's actually increase the speed a bit. And then I can refresh my scene. And so now I'm a bit faster and I can jump a lot higher. Looks like my walking animation is not, oh, I guess I just can't see the legs. So I might need to edit the walking animation so I can see the legs a bit better here. But you can see that the art from the platform is overlapping with the player because the collider is like under the top of the art. If we wanted to fill in the bottoms of these platforms, we can select another tile of the same space. This is something that you can do, but it makes it tricky to edit in the future. So I'm going to go back to my tile set. So if I wanted to like use these bottom 3 guys here as another tile, I can actually do that. I can make a new single tile and select those. And that would just be my tile. And that's fine. The only problem here is it's going to make it harder to edit my tiles in the future. So you do want to be careful with that. You could create like more art at the bottom or something like that to make that a little bit easier. See, I already actually screwed up my tiles. So Let's go back here and let's see. Can I undo that? Yes. Okay. Okay, that looks better. And now I do have this platform thing here. So I can do that, but as you noticed, it was really easy to kind of screw things up. So I would avoid doing that. Just like make a copy of the art somewhere below and use that. Okay, so now we have a few platforms. Let's add another one of these guys over here. And you can start to see that my game is starting to take a little bit more shape. I want to take that one out, so I use the right click there. So we might need to zoom out a little bit. We can start to see that the game is actually starting to move across the scene, and that's why we had to add in a camera, and I'll go over that in a second, but there's one more tile I want to cover. And so I'm going to go back to my tile set, and I'm going to create an auto tile using this art right here. Auto tile is really complicated, and I'm not going to go over a ton of stuff right now, but I just want to show you guys the basics of how it works. And then I have a couple tutorials that you can check out if you want to get into more detail. So with auto tile, basically I'm going to set up some rules about how to draw the tiles, and Godot is going to fill them in for me. And so essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use this left area as the left side of the platform, and this one is the right, and then this is going to be the middle, and it's going to like stretch it out. So that's why I made these sort of like more regular shapes so that it would align across the art. Again, I really just like threw down two rectangles. I didn't spend a ton of time here. Anyway, I'm going to choose my region. Okay, and I'm going to add a collision again. I'm just going to put it in the middle. So actually, let's delete that one. Okay, for some reason it won't let me do that. So I have to select the tile first, then add the collider. So I'm just going to have the collider in the middle. I'm going to kind of ignore these edges, at least for now, just for the example. And then I'm going to go over to this thing called bit mask. And this is how I'm going to tell the Godot tile set like what to do with this auto tile. So I have to go under here and go to selected tile, and I'm actually going to change the bit mask to 3x3. It's a little bit easier to use it in 3x3. And then I'm going to draw these red dots. So this red dot, you can see right now I have basically a grid of 9 dots. And so the red dot in the middle represents the tile that we're on, which is like this middle part. And then we add other dots to say you're allowed to add a tile on this side or on this side. And so for our middle section, you can add tiles on either side. For our left section, you can only add tiles on the right. And for the other section, for the right section, you can only add tiles to the left. Auto tiling gets really complicated, and there's some cool tutorials on it, but this is really basic. What you're going to see is that it's going to stretch out the middle of the tile. So when I go back to my scene and I choose my platforms, now when I draw the tile, see how it fills in the middle with that middle tile? So now I can have these platforms where I don't have to like draw, both sides. So it makes it kind of fun to just draw like little platforms of any size that I want. And since those have a collider on them, they're also going to be interactive. So now I can hopefully get to these guys. I might have designed this in a way that is going to make it hard. Cool, so that actually works pretty well, except if I go off the edge. But now I have some platforms, and I can start to design the space both horizontally and vertically if I want to go in that direction. Okay, so that covers my platforms. Let's go back to our main scene and add in the background. So we're going to be using a parallax background for this. There's other ways to do this. You can, there's a lot of different options here. You don't have to use a parallax background, but I figured this would be the easiest way to add some kind of like cool depth to the scene. And it's also going to give me a chance to go over a couple different blending options. One of the things you might have noticed about the art is that all of my art is white and black. And I actually did that on purpose because I'm going to show you guys a way that we can add color. And I wanted to kind of emphasize this using the white and black, but you can do this with any color. It'll just change the way that the color is modified. but I'm going to do that with my backgrounds. So let's go in here and add. So a parallax background has some basic settings. We're going to kind of ignore most of those settings for now. All those settings are just set at the default. What we're going to do is set up our layers a little bit differently. So I have this parallax layer, and we're going to be changing the scale. You also notice that there's mirroring turned on. We're going to play with that a little bit as well. But to start, we need to actually add some art here. So I'm going to go to the parallax layer and I'm going to add a sprite. So I'm going to add in a sprite and click create. And then what I want to do is add in my background that covers up the whole scene. We're going to start with that. So I'm going to go up to my sprite and click texture and go to load, go to sprites, and I'm going to choose my background clouds, click open. So one thing you'll notice is that the clouds are offset, and that's because sprites by default draw from the center, whereas the parallax background is to draw from the top left. So to fix that, we just have to go to my sprite and click on transform, or wait, where is it? Offset, yeah, offset, and click turn off centered. So now the sprite is drawing from the left. Notice another thing, that there's 2 copies of my sprite, and if we look down a bit, you can see there's actually more copies down there. That's because I have mirroring on. You can mirror your layer going to the right or left or top and bottom. I actually have this at 1024, it should be 512. And so now you can see we're mirroring that background, so it copies that background. And you can do that at different rates. It doesn't have to be exactly, the same exactly here. If I like increase this value to 2048 or something like that, then it would only repeat the clouds every other frame. But this allows me to create a background that moves, but also repeats, so that I don't have to like constantly be creating new backgrounds. I'm going to leave this at 1024. So right now, without any other settings, these clouds are just going to kind of be in the background, and they're just going to move along with the rest of the scene, exactly the way everything else is moving. Okay, so if we want them to have some motion, then we can use the parallax setting. So on the scale here, that's where I'm going to set something different. So it's going to move at a different scale. I'm just going to change the X because I'm mostly moving this way, but you can change on both X and Y. So I'm going to change that to something very small, like 0.9. So it's just a little bit different, but you'll notice that the clouds are going to start to move at a different pace than the rest of my scene. So that makes them look like they're kind of, at a different depth. And if I fall off the edge, we're probably going to see, oh, no, we're not. We don't have that setting on yet. Okay, so that's one layer. So that's pretty cool. So now what we can do is just duplicate that layer. So I can go to duplicate in my context menu, or I can hit Command D. And then let's take this second cloud layer and let's just change the scale a little bit. We'll say 0.8. And then let's also offset the transform a bit, maybe by 128 pixels, or maybe that's too much. Let's actually do it pretty close. Let's do like 32 pixels, and let's offset the Y by like 16. So now if we play the scene, now we have 2 layers that are moving at different paces. And so that is actually like maybe a little bit too much movement, maybe not super realistic. So we can change that. But you can see how you can start to get these different depth effects. I'm also using the exact same art, so it looks the same, so that makes it a little confusing. You can use different layers with different art. So let's actually change the scale a bit closer. Let's say like 0.85. So now they'll move a little bit more together. So it's not perfect, but we can start to see how this motion is kind of going to be kind of interesting. Another thing that we can do that I mentioned before is change the color. So if I take this layer and I go down to the visibility, notice that I can toggle the visibility on and off. That's really simple, but there's also a color that I can use to modulate. So if I choose this color, and there's lots of complicated things we can do here, but because my clouds are white, it's pretty easy just to choose a different color, and they're just going to take on whatever color that is because of the blending mode. There's more complicated stuff we can do here, but I'm just going to leave this as is. So we can make our clouds in the background kind of blue, and then I can go to the other layer and make those clouds maybe a lighter blue. So I can kind of play with the different colors even though I'm using the same art. And I can also do that for my tile map with my platforms under visibility. If I wanted to make these guys a color, you know, I can go in here and find a color that looks good. You know, maybe if they're supposed to be grass, they can be green. If they're supposed to be dirt, they can be kind of brown. Whatever you think looks good. Notice it changes everything that's part of that tile map. I could make another tile map and just choose a different color on there. So I can do kind of like multiple different variations there. Let's go with like a light green for these guys so they can look kind of like grass. Okay, so one more layer for my parallax where I'm gonna add individual sprites. So I don't have to just add one background, I can add a bunch of sprites. So let's actually duplicate this layer again. But for this sprite, I'm gonna go to the texture and clear. And then I'm gonna go and select, I'm gonna select my cloud sprite. This is the one where I have 4 different clouds arranged like a sprite sheet, but I'm not doing animation here. I'm just using it to save all the art in one place. So notice it starts by adding all 4. That actually kind of looks cool. I might stick with that, but that's not ultimately what I want. So I'm gonna go to the animation section. Even though I'm not animating, I'm gonna turn on 2 V frames and 2 H frames. Okay, so now I have a single sprite, and look what's gonna happen. This is gonna be super easy. This frame is 0, and now I'm just gonna take this sprite and duplicate it, drag it over here, and then I'm gonna go to animation and just turn this frame to 1. Now I have my second sprite. So I'm gonna duplicate that again, Command D, we'll take this guy over here, go to animation, frame 2, and then we're gonna duplicate it again. So this is gonna make my process for adding and editing my art a lot faster. So it's gonna save a lot of repetitive tasks of dragging and dropping and doing all this stuff. So now I have a layer with 4 sprites. Let's change the color of this layer a little bit. So that's actually just that one sprite. So let's make sure we have the layer selected. And I'll do like maybe a darker blue here. Notice that the one sprite that I made red now looks kind of like gray. So we can modify the individual sprites as well, and it's gonna add the colors together. That might start to get a little bit more complicated. And since these clouds are smaller, let's actually make this motion a little bit faster. Let's say like 1.05. So they're gonna move actually faster in the scene than the background. So now we have a lot going on in the scene. It's actually a little bit hard to see where everything is. So you might want to choose, I choose a lot of kind of lighter colors. We might want to choose some darker colors to make some things stand out. Anyway, that's my basic tile map and my background. So that's the main things that I wanted to cover in this video. And that should get you started as far as adding platforms and scenery. You guys should have a little bit more going on. I mentioned there should be at least 3 different elements. So besides the platforms and I have the clouds, you need at least one more element. But obviously the more stuff you add to the scene, the more complicated and sort of interesting it can look. One last thing I wanted to go over in this project is the new camera. So one of the things we notice is that as we start to move across our platforms, outside of the main scene, we need a camera to actually follow the player. If we didn't have this camera in the scene and we just stuck with like the main basic scene, this is what would happen. Well, looks like it doesn't matter if I turn my camera off. So let's just go ahead and turn off the tracking. So this is what would happen without the camera. Once our player gets over to the side of the screen, they just disappear and we don't really know what's happening. So the player could be falling off forever and we'd have, no idea. So in order to follow the player, we have to set up a camera that moves through the scene with the player. And there's a couple settings here. So the default setting is to track horizontally. And you can see there's a few other settings: track vertically, follow horizontal, and then the follow speed. So by default, it's only going to track horizontal, which means that it just tracks the player wherever the player moves, but only on the horizontal axis. So if the player jumps, the camera stays in the same place. So now see the difference if I track vertically as well. Now the camera is going to jump with the player. Okay, so that adds some dimensionality to the scene. And if you want to go higher in the scene, you are going to need to use that tracking a bit to follow the player as they go higher. So if you're building a platform that's going up, you're going to need to use that vertical tracking. If you're only going to one side, you can just stick with the horizontal tracking. Notice it also changes the way my scene looks. Now I can see all this stuff on the bottom, so I'm going to have to incorporate that into my design. And if I fall, now we get to see our repeating stuff and how the gravity works. Looks pretty cool. Okay. Eventually we'll put in something to make it so the player just, respawns somewhere if that happens. There's one other option on here, which is going to turn off the horizontal tracking. And I also recommend probably turning off the vertical tracking as well, although it will still work, which is the follow horizontal. And so this is pretty basic, but basically what this does is it waits for the player to get a certain distance, and then the camera is going to follow the player. So that way we can actually move backwards in the scene a bit and move around without necessarily moving the camera. It's a little glitchy. I still want to work some stuff out. Right now I have it set so that the speed is pretty close to the player's speed, but we can actually change the follow speed. So if I move that down, then we're going to see a bit of a delay in the camera movement. And that's kind of an interesting effect. I think I could probably code this in a better way, so I'll probably work on that for the next version. One problem here is if the camera is slower than the player can go off the screen, so you might get stuck, you might fall off the edge, which is what happened. So that's an option. If you want to use it, you can stick with track horizontal or do follow. You can also increase the follow speed so the camera just snaps directly to the player really quickly. There's probably like a better math that I could use there, like some sort of like easing or something like that, but maybe for the next lab, I'll incorporate that. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off, reset this. Last thing I'm going to do in this video is go over how to submit the homework. So once you have your scene set up and you're happy with the way everything looks, we're going to play the scene and we're going to take a screenshot. So in Mac, this is really easy. In Windows, there's ways to do this as well. You can refer to the earlier videos that I posted on how to do this. But you can basically get your scene somewhere where it looks good. Looks like I added a little guy down here by mistake. So once you're happy with where the scene looks, on the Mac, what you can do, and I think I've talked about this before with screenshots, is I'm going to hit Command-Shift-4, and then I'm going to hit space, and that's going to give me this little camera. And then when I click, it's just going to take a screenshot of the Godot window by itself. If you want to do the thing where you drag it, that's fine as well, but it's nice to have like a nice clean screenshot. So once you have that screenshot, it's going to be on your desktop. If you're on Mac, on Windows, it might be in your pictures folder or something like that. But once you have a screenshot that you're happy with, it's a good thing to like save this. So you might just put like a new folder, screenshots or something like that. It's good to get in the habit of like saving your work as you're working on it, so you can kind of see your progress over time. So I'm going to put this screenshot into my screenshots folder just so I don't lose it. I'm going to delete these other screenshots. And so that's basically all you have to do for the blog post, along with writing a little bit about each one of the scenic elements that you add, how it fits into the world of your game. And so to add this to my blog post for the homework, I would just go back to the Open Lab. And if I'm logged in, I can click New Post. And so I'm going to, say this is my scenery and platforms, or whatever you want to call it. And then just drag this image on here, and then write a few sentences about each element. So why did you use clouds, or why did you use trees, or what the significance of the different elements in your scene is. And that should be pretty much everything. So then you can, publish your post and submit that on Blackboard. So I think I've covered everything. If you guys have any questions, let me know. We can go over them on Discord during class, or if you have questions before or after class, I'm always happy to go over them at another time. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you guys in class.